Welcome to you. Welcome to Ordinary Sunday 33, I think. It's got to this stage of the year where it's all a bit of a fog. Welcome especially to Bishop Justin Duckworth from the Diocese of Wellington, technically from Whanganui, and currently from about 50 metres away from me, down the corridor in a motel in New Plymouth. Welcome back, Gillian. Welcome back, Jonathan. Let's go, Gillian, to you with a bit of background on this, well, I think very topical but very difficult passage.
Definitely a difficult passage. I think there's a couple of things I'd want to mention. I mean, first of all, we've got Jesus in Jerusalem. He's been in Jerusalem since chapter 19. This is like the heart of the Jewish people in terms of being the city of God. It's the heart of their faith and the temple. And when he arrived in the city, he wept over it and predicted its destruction. He's cleansed it and he's been teaching in it. So this temple in the heart of the city of Jerusalem is so fundamental. And I think despite all that, this idea of it going to be destroyed is phenomenal. Would have been quite a shocking thing. This thing that is at the heart of their political, cultural, religious centre is going to be destroyed. So I think that's quite a interesting thing to bear in mind, because of course it would seem that the Gospel of Luke was written after the actual destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by General Titus, later Emperor Titus, in the year 70. So the readers are very much aware of that huge cataclysmic change in their world. And the other thing I'd want to mention too, I think is so important, is the kind of writing that this is, which seems to be apocalyptic. That idea of revealing something about the world in the real way in which the world appears. So rather than the surface level, a deeper revealing of what's really going on. I think to hold in mind that its purpose was to give encouragement and hope.
Okay, well, let's hold on to that. That's a really good leverage into the passage. And let's go to you, Justin, first of all, and ask you, but what do you find challenging when you read this?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Michael. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Actually, I'm just going to come to, I read the passage and just where I bounced to straight away in my head. So this is not a deep theological dive. This is just me personally, what spoke to me. First of all, I did find it a really difficult passage. When I saw what we had drawn, I was like, oh no, it's not a narrative. It's not a parable. It's like, oh, what is this? And so initially I was like, oh, this is tough. But four things that I found challenging. First was how initially it starts with this idea of they were looking and they're admiring the beauty of the temple. And I straight away thought of our Anglican churches and how we love the beauty of our churches and the beauty of our worship. And we love beauty. And so I found that, straight away sort of got my attention. Second thing was, which I'm sure of all of us, is I think this, when it talks about massive destruction on every different level, I couldn't help but think of our world at this moment: Ukraine, climate change, cost of living increases, incredible polarization. I just thought if any time in my life this feels the closest to this passage. So straight away there's a challenge there to name our times. Third thing, though, that challenged me is in the center of this passage was the Christians, so to speak, the followers of Jesus. I'm a bit worried that we wouldn't be the center of contemporary society and that nobody would be dragging us away to question us around the destruction that's happening in the world and our place in that. So I'm a little bit challenged by the church's perceived irrelevance, if I may say that, which I went to. And the last one is just a little minor one. I'm sure we all picked it, but where it assures us that not a hair in our head will be hurt, but the verse before it says some of us will be put to death. I've just got to put it out there. I found that a little bit challenging in that how to marry those two things together.
Thank you. Absolutely, and it's mind-blowing to hold them together. So let's flick it to you, Jonathan, and you navigate us through that.
Well, I think for the disciples, the news that the temple was going to be destroyed would have been pretty terrifying. Even though apparently the Shekinah glory that had existed in the temple had disappeared in the exile and never returned, nonetheless, the temple was the center of their identity. And for over 1,000 years, it had been part of their identity, and it signified 1,000 years of God's dealing with Israel. And the idea of the temple being destroyed had to have brought the exile to mind, and it's all the destruction and the literally leaving the land they loved to mind. And if warfare wasn't bad enough, of course, there are false messiahs, earthquakes, famines, and all the rest of it, along with parents betraying them and them being put to death. And it's all pretty challenging. And even though Jesus is, we assume, talking about 70 AD, the very idea that all these things can happen to Christians, I mean, Jesus was really clear that they're going to have a heck of a hard time, is a bit of a challenge.
Okay, so we're not being left in the comfort zone here, clearly, from both of you. And Gillian, when you read this, where does it take you in terms of challenge?
I found it obviously very challenging too. And I thought, what an interesting passage to have an ordinary time. We've got this kind of pretty extraordinary passage. And yet I think there's that idea that, every generation faces these sorts of challenges and have had all sorts of crises to deal with. And we are no different, but perhaps on that global scale that Justin was talking about, we're feeling it maybe more. But it was the hair on the head one, and yet you'll be all right kind of verse juxtaposition that I really struggle with too. Yeah, so we can get kind of caught up in the whole thing of the timings of the end, like when is the end actually coming? What's it going to look like? And I'm a fan of TV programs like The Walking Dead, or kind of dystopic apocalyptic literature, The Hunger Games, and movies and all sorts of things. But more about the truth, I think, is the challenge for me. What is the truth that I'm living by, and the truth of the good news, and am I showing that in the midst of this kind of chaos and crisis, and just kind of holding on to that and kind of standing firm somehow in the midst of it all is a challenge.
Okay, that's great and quite personal. And so let's not leave ourselves in the darkness, because Jesus doesn't. Let's go and begin to tease out from you, Jonathan, some good news as you read this.
Yes, I couldn't help thinking it was a pretty bleak passage, but Jesus brightens the mood somewhat by telling them that they don't need to prepare for their trials, and it'll be an opportunity to testify for him, although that might not delight less adventurous souls. And the disciples will be given words and wisdom to confound their enemies. That's good news. However, not a hair of your head will perish, Jesus said, and by your endurance you will gain your souls. And immediately after our particular passage, he also refers to the coming of the Son of Man on a cloud with great power and glory. And if this is the culmination of our passage, which is, in my view, redolent with bad news, it's good news indeed.
And is that, it may not be fair to throw this to you, but a hint of the Shekinah returning? Anyway, Gillian, to you.
I think so.
To find some good news there.
I think there's definitely good news, firstly in the fact that, we are not alone in this. The entire, story of the Jewish people, the Christian people, is one of facing challenges and holding on and trying to persevere, and having that hope of Christ's return, but of, the Spirit with us to inspire us and encourage us and comfort us in these difficult times. Yes, hope is hope in the midst of crisis.
Thank you. And Justin, where do you extract good news here?
Yeah, I think if I remember the passage, it literally tells us again, which it does all the way through Scripture, do not be afraid, or don't be afraid, etc. And I did think, there's a promise of Scripture that is recorded, a lot in Scripture. And I think it speaks to our contemporary society in a real strong way. I mean, I don't know about you fellas, maybe it's just a Wellington thing, but I think we live in a society that is anxious. I think we see the rise of anxiety everywhere. So I think this idea that God promises to meet us in our anxiety and anxiousness and speaks directly to it is actually a contemporary good news, because I think we are plagued with it. The second thing is, bouncing back to where I said earlier, was I'm a little bit worried that in our contemporary society, of all the issues we're facing, that, what is the part that Christians have to play? And I kind of took a huge leap of Scripture here. This is a leap, and Gillian and Jonathan, apologies. But I did like the fact that Jesus promises words of wisdom. And I think we are lacking wisdom as a society. I mean, we've got very complex problems around the globe now in our own country. And it just may be that there is some wisdom that we could do with imparting to us. And maybe we could be wise people, as God would promise us that he would give us that wisdom. I think actually it's really relevant nowadays.
Yeah.
Good news, wisdom, Let's go to the application of that, though, and hear from you, Jonathan, because we need to apply this stuff. It's not just head stuff.
Yeah. So leaving the early disciples aside, we're to stand up and raise our heads because our redemption draws near, and be alert at all times, praying that we have the strength. And this is advice which is given in the passage immediately following ours. And it could well be encapsulated in the verse, I think, by your endurance you will gain your souls. Because for me, there are few things like looking in faith and prayer to typify endurance. A constant faith and a constant prayer requires endurance for a start, and it is in itself a form of endurance. It's a form of tuning into God and being strengthened by God. And I think this so what is quite important, because certainly in Auckland, we're talking a great deal about a post-COVID societal malaise, which is not necessarily literally attached to those who've had COVID, but it's a general thing, and it has affected the church a great deal. And so I reckon that a faith that endures and prayer that is constant and enduring is probably a good approach in these times.
Okay, so I'm hearing endurance very clearly from your application.
I think it's really interesting that there's those tiny verses just before this passage about the widow offering her, small coins compared to the wealthy, and this is what was going on in the temple. And the disciples, as Justin said, looking at the beauty of the temple and just relishing in that. And yet Jesus' perspective on it was that this is a system that's unjust. There's injustice going on here and what he's seen with the wealthy and the poor. But I think the so what is to actually speak out with those words that the Spirit will give us to issues of injustice. And what's really important in terms of being the church, is it the beautiful buildings, or is it us actually working towards equity and things like that in our society? And then perhaps maybe by speaking out to our issues that are causing these crises, maybe we will return a little bit, as Justin said, to that centre where, maybe we will become a prophetic voice in our society once again.
Yes, indeed. And Justin and I are at a conference where we're hearing very strongly the voice of those who've been really neglected in the history of the church in New Zealand. Let's give to you, though, Justin, the final word here, the application, the so what, when you encounter this passage.
Yeah, sure. I kind of went for the so what being to reimagine again the Anglican middle way. I feel like as we live in a very challenging moment in history, as the disciples did, I think there's three responses. First response is we can just bury our head in the sand and act like it doesn't really happen, and and we just ignore it. I think many people are ignoring the reality of the world as we speak because it's just too complex and too challenging and too problematic. So one response. Second response is we can be crazily triumphalistic, thinking that it's like, yes, there's that stuff, but really it's not really that bad, and we're just going to rise through that, and a kind of brain-dead triumphalistic positivity, also problematic. And I think the place to stand is to fully grasp reality, but to engage and enter into reality. The language they use here is standing firm and being bearers of hope. And I think that's the place we need to inhabit. We need to inhabit the place where we clearly grasp reality. We are present to reality, but we are bearers of hope and we stand firm. I go to that passage in Ephesians where they talk about the armor of God, and I can't remember, 3 or 4 times in that passage, the armor of God, they say, all you got to do is stand. You don't have to move forward even, you just got to stand. You got to be present. We've got to be in the dialogue. We've got to be in the world as bearers of hope. Not head in the sand, not crazy triumphalistic, grasp reality, bearers of hope, standing firm.
Very little we can add to that. Well, thank you very much, all three of you. Lovely to have you on board and great.